not, this is not my first infectious outbreak, but it is my first pandemic. I think it's all of our first pandemic. So some of this is going to be new for some of us, and for the rest, maybe a refresher. Really grateful to Essay to bring us together, and really hoping that as we go through that we can share a lot of ideas. Kiki had a great interactive presentation, and really want to see a lot of comments and questions as we're kind of going through. That helps me catch my breath, but really more importantly, there's a lot of talent on this call, and a lot of folks that have lived a lot of these things directly. So want to make sure that we're here to share knowledge. Really, that's what associations are about, you know, in terms of bringing people together, sharing knowledge. And as Kiki was saying, building that sense of community. So please feel free to jump in as we're going through here. A lot of material to cover, and I'll go kind of fast. I know this is being recorded and it'll be distributed later. So if there's a link or something that you see, we'll try to share that as much as possible as we're going through. So again, I mean, please, if you have a perspective from an association, somebody who might have lived through a crisis, I know some quick shout out to my friends at Corning Place. I think Josh is somewhere in the room. Good people, want to encourage them to jump in. I've respected a lot of work that they've done and their perspective on some of their crises. And a quick thank you to Kiki. I mean, great sense of, community, and you've inspired the last slide of my presentation as we're all in this together. So stay tuned for that. So what I want to cover, let me just get my buttons all oriented here. So within the next hour, do a very quick introduction and a little bit about my background, in particular in crisis PR. This is usually where we would then segue into helping you understand how to recognize or respond to a crisis at the business level. Now, this is pretty obvious, already, so we're not going to spend too much time here. There's a couple acronyms that'll bring us through, in particular, PAIR, and we'll talk about that, how that might help guide the response. And I think what I've seen a lot of people worried about or struggling over the last week or two is that sense of, what do I do, and what do I say, and when do I say it, and how do I make decisions, and what's the right tone? And we'll kind of go through some of that, and even finish up with some actionable tips. These are not things that are expensive, and a lot of things that you're already doing. So we'll talk a little bit about how to tailor messages for the press and social media. I think some of us have been thrust into the spotlight and have been having conversations in the media, and certainly on social media, more than we normally would. In particular, I think because the hospitality industry has been hit pretty hard. It's one of the organizations earlier. So again, we'll have some tips, and please, a lot of Q&A as we're going through. I'll try to keep an eye on the comments and questions, and Vanessa's going to jump in and interrupt me so that I can kind of focus. So I'm going to have a little help today in the presentation from Winston Churchill, Tony Hayward, who was BP's CEO during the Horizon disaster. We'll hear from Henry Kissinger and Barry Bonds, really the folks you think of when you think of guiding you through a crisis, or maybe not. So we'll have some fun with this as we're going through. So again, a quick introduction. I'm with Over It Media. I know a lot of you know Alex Tancredi, my colleague. We've been really enjoying our relationship with Essay, and even a lot of familiar faces in the room over the last several years. We're a team of 42 people, and normally these are just great pictures of what our facility looks like. Unfortunately, this is probably what the facility looks like, with nobody at their desks and nobody in our studio. Anyway, just some of that, and just a bit about some relevant experience that we have. I cut my teeth early in my career helping Adelphi University through their crisis. They had some leadership issues. The State Board of Regents came in and fired their trustees. Their CEO was one of the highest paid nonprofits, but it was a fabulous institution that really needed a rebrand. St. Luke's Cornwall, for our friends in the Hudson Valley, had some issues a while back. Adversarial relationships with the media, the police, so much so that they even commissioned cartoon illustrators to show them duking it out. I worked with the Citadel Military College and worked with them to try to launch some new academic programs in light of a sexual harassment scandal, or a sex scandal, that was really identical to what was happening at Penn State at the same time it was happening at Penn State. helping Brooklyn Hospital Center not only rebrand itself after its bankruptcy, but then a few years later, once they got on their feet, had a very public medical malpractice case. A woman who was perhaps misdiagnosed, but was discharged a quadriplegic, and how do you regain the trust from the community? And a few infectious diseases outbreaks, a case of C. diff in Central New York, and most recently have been the spokesperson for a Legionella outbreak. So happy to share some of these perspectives and things that I've learned. And before you think I'm really smart and I have all the answers, I had my own crisis. Meet Michelle, the bookkeeper at my former agency. Michelle took $800,000 from us over 6 years. So I was really in the trenches myself, looking at how we maintain a reputation, try to move the business forward and that. So I believe she's still in her own sense of quarantine right now. So anyway, some things that I've lived through. I have been a CEO of a member-driven organization, a museum. Happy to share some of those perspectives. But again, a lot of you folks are living the association world, meeting in hotel venues and TPAs. So I want to hear from some comments and questions as we're going through. So yeah, this is again usually the point of the presentation where I ask what's keeping you up at night, but I think I have a pretty good sense of that. I feel like, and here's what we're going to hear from Barry Bonds, I feel like I'm waking up every morning and I'm looking at coronavirus outbreak statistics the way that we looked at Barry Bonds' home run scores. Okay, what number are we up to today? What number's happening in my county? You know, what's going on from here? So that's certainly what's been keeping, I think, a lot of us just, are we talking about anything else, really? So does this sound familiar? Do we keep this event that we're planning or do we cancel it? Do we do it online? Are we contributing to the hype? You know, if we say something or do something, or what are our competitors or what are our friends across town doing? If we say this, do we sound like we're being tone deaf? But look, we got to move our business forward. We need the income. And at the end of the day, what's going to happen to our employees or what's going to happen to our members or visitors, and then when do we blow the all clear whistle and resume business as usual? I think a lot of that sounds like certainly everything that we were talking about last week. This week is really adjusting to that sense of new normal. We've now adjusted our business models. We're trying to do things differently, let everybody know that we're doing things differently. And so how we kind of, get through that and move forward as best as possible by minimizing that damage to our brands. And that's really sort of the core thing that I'm trying to talk about today, is really just helping all of us avoid missteps, making sure that we don't sound like we're tone deaf, that we don't say the wrong thing, that we don't do the wrong thing wherever possible. So getting a sense of what to say, when to say it, is a lot of what we'll cover in the next hour or so. So why does crisis communications matter? We've always believed that any organization, in particular associations, meeting venues, TPAs, you have built up a reputation and a brand in the mind of the public. They think of you in a certain light and they enjoy their membership with you, what you've done for them in their careers, the experiences they've had in your venues, what you're doing for your counties and regions. And it's not something that shows up on a balance sheet. And I always believed that it should. I felt like that was an asset that really needed to be protected and nurtured as much as our other tangible assets. As a hotel, we have a bricks and mortar and a sense of those kind of things, and that has value. There was an old example when Pan Am went bankrupt about 20, 25 years ago. They sold the planes, they sold the typewriters, they sold all the equipment, and they literally sold the brand for $1.5 million. And the sense was like, well, wait, who would want to buy the brand of a bankrupt airline? But the notion that that has equity and it has value, and then someday somebody may want to start a new airline, and doing that on the Pan Am brand, I believe that business would get up to speed a lot faster than it would if it was just Paul's Airlines. So I think that's an asset that we need to think about, and thinking about it as an asset and something that we need to protect, I think is very important. So people also remember how the crisis was handled long after the crisis. They'll remember how you sounded, how you treated them. And frankly, the long-term damage is done before and after the crisis more than it is, during the crisis itself. Done right, I think what you're communicating during what we're all going through can really help minimize the damage to your organization, to your brand. Certainly helps morale. I think Kiki's presentation was fabulous. The community themes that she sent, was really just, it made us, I think, made me feel a lot better, like the sense that we are all in this together. So really an important point, I think, is, and this is one of the common themes in my presentation, the need for communication is going to grow the longer the crisis is happening. So the more this goes on and on, the more often and more frequent you're going to want to be communicating with your constituents, however you define those. Whether it's your members as an association, the people that live in your county, the event planners that bring things to your hotels, and really, I think that's one of the things I want us to keep in mind as we're going through and when I summarize later. Certainly the news media will have a significant impact on any crisis. I mean, I think that this is a generic statement of any crisis communication. The media, and in particular, conversations that flare up pretty quickly on social media, more so today. I think we're seeing a lot, us as an ad agency, we're even shifting our media buys from the kind of routine program, but this, people are actually sort of watching TV during the day, maybe at lunch, but in particular, everybody seems to be glued to the news. So paying attention to that, I think, is important. We'll talk a little bit about how to prepare for media conversations if you find yourself sort of thrust in the spotlight. This isn't going to be, I guess, a lot of media training, but what I did want to share is just some tips and thoughts, just to get you thinking about, how to prepare for any type of communication. We won't spend too much time on that as we go through, but just to give you a sense of what's ahead. So it's pretty obvious and pretty easy to identify a crisis in many instances. Although this one, this is usually, again, the part of the presentation where we look to make sure that we are all identifying that a crisis is happening. And I'll talk about that in a second. So really, a crisis, obviously what we're all living and going through, is affecting the economy. It's affecting a downturn in a lot of our business, our own personal income. The true definition of it, and I won't read this word for word, but it's basically anything that happens that is adverse to your normal business operations at any particular scale. Anything that's going to distract you from what your core job, your core mission is, and delivering on that. Any distraction, whether it's a simple employee disciplinary issue or something bigger like what we're facing right now, that's the true definition of a crisis. So yeah, check. We're kind of going through it in case you were wondering. It's official. But that said, one of the things I wanted to share, and this just came out this morning, was how to identify this crisis and what's happening within a bunch of different industries. So Moodys, and there's a link to this, unfortunately, I think it's login protected. I think you need to have an account. But Moodys basically looked at all of the global sectors and industries and categorized these into 4 different areas. In the center in blue, what are the organizations or types of companies that are going to really benefit from this? The bottom right in green, what are the types of industries that are going to have very low exposure to this crisis? Top red, high exposure, who's already being affected, and in the left in orange, what industries will have moderate impact to this. And again, this depends on, we could all blow the all clear whistle and find out social distancing was great and we're all back to work on April 1st. Realistically, this is going to be here for some time. And so this is their forecasting, assuming this is a couple months and not something that's protracted through the whole summer and fall. Unfortunately, not telling you something you already know, lodging and leisure travel, tourism, is taking a big hit initially, but in particular, things that bring people together, anything that requires long-term planning, or physical engagement like retail, going to a shop or something like that's been hit particularly hard. So I thought I'd share this because a lot of associations on here that have members that, or even your own association that might fit into some of these categories. And just to give you a sense at least of what Moodys is, or how they're categorizing some of this. And again, some of this will be changing depending on the duration of what's happening here. So there's typically 2 types of crises, sudden and smoldering. I think I kind of break them into those 2 categories. Really quickly on sudden, this is a mass shooting, a fire, something that quickly flares up and is adverse, again, to your normal business operation. There's initial chaos and then a lot of aftershocks. You can sometimes prepare for them. sometimes they're pretty easy to establish facts and be consistent with your message. Speed is essential. I think how quickly you're reacting and responding to a crisis, the faster you can identify it and respond to it with a set of messages, and being consistent, I think, is critical to sort of protecting your reputation, protecting your institution's brand. In a sudden crisis, it's that first 30 minutes or first couple hours, getting out there and trying to report on things pretty quickly. I won't spend too much time on that because I think from a practical standpoint, we know that this isn't what we're all living through, and I'll spend a little bit more time on the other model, which is the smoldering. But in particular, I wanted to share this quote from Winston Churchill. When the eagles are silent, the parrots begin to jabber. If you're not talking and your leadership isn't out there with messages that your members or your constituents or stakeholders can use, it gets filled with a lot of noise, doubt, speculation, gossip, and nowhere more so than social media. The more you can be out there saying something, and we'll talk about that in a minute, you're going to have a little bit more control over the situation. Your constituents will feel a little bit more comforted by your presence and your ability to try to control the message and the timeline. So I bring this up, as sort of a playful quote to that sense of urgency for, getting out, communicating often and frequently with messages that matter. Because when you don't, the public starts to comment for you and things just get out of control. So the other type of crisis, and what I think we're all living through now, are those smoldering kind of issues, like this coronavirus, embezzlement. These are more likely to happen to organizations. They're harder to identify in early stages. Look, a week and a half ago, were any of us thinking that we would be here with this frog in the background and not there in person at the Century House, kind of having this conversation in person? But this smoldered for a little while, and then I think it flared up pretty quickly. So harder to identify in early stages. In the case of something like an embezzlement, it's something that leadership can sometimes avoid or ignore, maybe misunderstand the severity of it. But I think over the last week or so, we have all kind of gotten a sense of really what we're facing and what we think the impact might be to our various industries. In some cases, and human error is to blame. Certainly not in this case. We didn't create this. I think, to Kiki's point, this is something that we're all facing together. We have, I think, as she phrased it, that one common enemy that's, probably some good's going to come out of that sense of us rallying around all of it together. So sometimes these go away on their own. Sometimes they don't. And certainly this is the time that our organization's leadership is really going to be, tested. Their, abilities, their quality of leadership and strong decision-making, and ability to sort of, be that point of contact for their industry or their region, whatever, is pretty critical. So, obviously pretty easy for us to identify that we have been living through this type of crisis over the last week or so, and that it's here to stay for the short term. So I won't spend too much time on preparing, but getting into the responses, since really the preparing is that kind of thing that, all right, once this dust settles and we can all go back to normal, I wouldn't ignore this, concept that, maybe next time we get, now that we have some time over the summer or the fall, once we've gotten back to business and right-sized the ship a little bit, bringing that board together, your staff together to say, okay, if this happened again, if this flared up and we had a sudden crisis versus this smoldering type of crisis, what do we do? How do we handle it? What are the lessons that we've learned over those last few weeks and months that we went through it? What would we do different in the future? So we're certainly not in a position to be able to plan ahead for what we're living through, but once the dust settles, I think it's important that your organization go through this, and just get a sense of what did we learn, what do we want to do different, and how might we respond to something, and who should respond, and do we have the right toolkits and things. So building out those communication logistics, that sense of, do we need an extra set of hands on our staff to help us get through something because we need to keep the business moving forward, but now we have this added workload of dealing with a crisis. Unfortunately, I think most of our organizations are in the opposite, situation where, we're challenged with saying what's going to happen to our employees, and having extra staff is certainly a luxury. Although I see a lot of industries, supermarkets, delivery services, and things like that that are ramping up. I think for those of us in the capital region, I think this morning Price Chopper just announced they were hiring thousands of people to meet additional demands, either for delivery services or just to keep supermarkets moving. So, and then building out a communications toolkit. What are those things that we need to make sure we've got in place? Did we have all of our email lists updated? Are we ready to go with constant contact or whatever the tool is you're using? Who's the one working on the social media, those kind of things. Interestingly, and this comes into play, sometimes the media even learns about a crisis before you do. I've been in a couple situations where, either we or our client got a call from the media saying, hey, this just happened. Do you want to comment? Well, I'm gonna have to get back to you because I'm really not sure what you're talking about. Sometimes they can be on the site before you're ready. I think these are really more the sudden type of crisis. And another point that I think is worth noting, my second to last bullet, that sense of who should be the right person and the right face of the organization during a particular crisis. Sometimes they'll see people like me, your public relations or your communications person, as that spin doctor, that I'm here just to give you a canned message. But putting that right person out there, in the right circumstance, in some of the healthcare settings that I worked in, it didn't make sense to put the CEO out in front, and certainly not the public relations person, because that feels, again, like the spin doctor or the bean counter. But they wanted to hear from the chief medical officer. They wanted to hear from somebody who represented the clinical face of the organization as they went through. So I think that that's pretty important to keep in mind as well. It's not always the person at the top, although in a lot of cases, it certainly can be. So let's spend a fair amount of time in the kind of response, because now we're responding to these things. And there's a couple different acronyms I want to keep in mind and share with you. One is PAIR, and we'll talk about that. And then in particular, when building out some of the communication messages, those 3 C's. So the big question that a lot of people were asking us, and certainly in situations like this, ask is, well, what do I say? When do I say it? In what order? To whom? And making sure that there aren't any missteps. So for that, I think this is where we start, and I use my friendly PAIR acronym. And again, if this was in person at the Century House, well, you can imagine you'd all have a nice snack. But I guess I encourage you to go see, for those of you fortunate, and please hold up your video if you have one at home. I think the PAIR acronym is important, and this is something that I use as an acronym to help people remember the proper order of which you're not only making decisions as an organization, but communicating. So the PAIR stands for people, environment, assets, and reputation. And in particular, that order. It's people first, then you worry about the environment, then you worry about the organization's assets, and then you worry about the reputation of the organization last. And it's really, really important to keep that sequence in mind. When you start to put things out of order or ignore them, bad things happen. So thankfully, we can learn some lessons from people. They had some missteps and did some of these things out of order. So what can we learn from people who didn't necessarily follow that sort of sequence? They made the mistakes, frankly, so you don't have to. So anyone remember, this is maybe 5-7 years ago, the Deepwater Horizon issue? There was an oil rig off Louisiana, and there was a pretty devastating explosion and fire. This was so dramatic that they actually made a movie about it starring Mark Wahlberg. This is how bad of a crisis it was. And if anybody can remember the misstep from that, Tony Hayward, who I promised at the beginning of the presentation, was really criticized for very thoughtless comments that he was making during the crisis. And in particular, as people were saying to him, well, what are you going through and what's on your mind as a leader? He kept saying for a couple of days, look, I want my life back. I just want things to go back to normal. And was really, really criticized for the insensitivity. Look, Tony, 11 people in your organization died on that rig. I bet they want their lives back too. So I'm sorry that this is a bit of an inconvenience to you, but this is what we're counting on you to do as an organizational leader. So, again, keeping in mind that, it's people first, and certainly not that kind of response, that you want from any organization, and the criticism that he received as a organizational leader for that misstep. Hey, I think we saw this knucklehead this week on social media, didn't we? Now, he doesn't represent a organization, but these kids in Miami, these spring breakers, are being insensitive. I think, they're putting themselves first, they're being selfish, they're not considering the needs of people in general in the context that they exist in a broader society, and they're just going about what they're doing and becoming particularly criticized. Again, this isn't an organizational leader, but this is what happens when you're not sensitive to both that sequence, people first, thinking about what's happening, and being a little bit more empathetic for what's happening around you. Just as recently as this morning, this is not necessarily a response to a crisis, but a good example of what happens, your own decision-making in this. The public is being very critical of what they're perceiving as, frankly, an insensitivity. I think people are saying, look, we want our leaders to be sensitive, to warn the public, to comment on what's happening, share what they know as quickly as possible so we can all make decisions, not go and share your stock. If that's in fact what happened, there's some speculation that I don't have control over my investments, I leave these to other people, but it's certainly, and I think if that is the case, they need to say that very quickly and very loudly to regain their own trust with their constituents. For now, the speculation among the media is that they were being selfish and not putting the interests of their people first as they were going through that whole process. Even on a local basis, this was this morning, responding as quickly as possible. If an institution knows what's happening, but in this case, waits 13 hours to respond, there's going to be a bit of criticism and an accusation that they're not taking this seriously and responding with the, needs of their organization in mind. So anyway, I think these are important just in terms of just some context, to see some mistakes that other folks made, kind of bring to light the importance of the right sequence and what you're going to be saying and when you're going to be saying it as you're going through. So with that in mind, there's the 3 C's. So we talked about that pair, and for most of us, again, let me back up for a second to go back to this pair. So, let's pretend for a second that your organization is a hotel or meeting venue and there's a fire. What you're commenting about and, talking about is, very important that you put these in the right sequence. So if you're asked to comment, with the fire trucks, behind you and the thing happening immediately, your first comment should be about the people. The first thing that we're focusing on is to make sure that everybody got out, the first responders are all okay, and everything else. The second issue is, well, we want to make sure that this fire isn't causing any environmental damage, or there's a spill or something that's happening as a result of it. And then the last thing, once those first have been addressed in the media and on social media, then you worry about the assets. Then you can say, geez, we're really disappointed that the hotel burned down, and then lastly, what is this going to do to our reputation, as an organization? So, just kind of bringing that out as maybe a little bit more of a tangible example, because I don't think any of us own oil rigs or, have millions of dollars in stock. And if you do, good for you. So as we go through this, I think it's important. The other thing that I think helps is the 3 C's. There we go. In terms of how you communicate during a crisis. Certainly this is what I'm trying to convey here, is that sense of what is the appropriate tone and manner, of what you want to say during a crisis and how you communicate what you're saying. The first is that sense of control. And I don't mean to mislead and tell anybody, especially in this instance, that, oh, we're completely under control. This coronavirus thing, we've got it licked. But a sense of at least, our organization is trying to control the situation. We're meeting often, we're making decisions, we're looking to trusted resources such as government entities and agencies. We're in constant dialogue with our elected officials. All of those things are helping us make decisions so that we can best, control our response to the situation. I think it's important also, as you're communicating to any of your constituents, to let them know that there are competent professionals working to solve this crisis. Not a bad thing to be putting out on social media right now. Take a little screenshot of what I'm seeing on my screen hey, here's our board of XYZ association. We're all getting together this week on a video call, and we wanted to share with you folks a screenshot of that on social media to tell you that look at, all the talent that's bringing this organization together to make decisions, So the more that you can, tell your constituents and your publics and stakeholders that your organization's leadership, staff and board or whatever are constantly working to get through this situation. And if you need outside guidance, that's a great thing to talk about as well. For a client of mine that had a Legionnaire's disease outbreak, they and we went and retained experts. We're not experts in water purification and Legionnaire's disease. We needed a third party that could help guide us and show us and tell us what to do in addition to the state guidelines. So we were doing more of what was being asked of us. And in particular, I think being guided by those and letting the public and people know, gives them that sense of reassurance. And again, with that PAIR acronym in mind, that sense of concern and caring, here's how we can help, here's how you can help. So again, I think the 3 C's, really a good acronym or tool to use to remind you it's not necessarily what you say, but how you're saying it. That care and concern is going to build up credibility in the minds of the people that you're communicating with. So this next slide is a little bit more for those sudden crises, but again, that first 30 minutes sets the tone, or within the first few days sets the tone of what you're doing. Letting people at least know you're thinking about it, you're aware of it, you're bringing your leadership together to talk about it, gather those facts, and in particular, thinking ahead in terms of what do we think the impact is going to be of the organization. Developing response options. How do we want to communicate with folks? Is it phone calls, emails, social media, press releases, press conferences? And then in particular, what are our options for what we want to say and when we want to say it, before, during, and after or something. Understanding who the appropriate person is. And again, this is not always the executive director or CEO of an organization. If there's an issue regarding membership, it might be your membership director that might be, a better face to it. But in particular, and I think I'll cover this, I might be getting ahead of myself here, but humanizing what we're going through, putting a face on your communication to your constituents, I think is critical. I know I have this in a subsequent slide, but I'll mention it now because I think it's important to humanize the response. People want to hear from people, not logos. So if your email is going out with a headshot of your executive director, I think that that's really important because it just gives them a sense that there are people behind it, not a logo for, XYZ association or whatever it could be. Again, sharing information in the right sequence is critical. Your staff and board need to hear about something as quickly as possible, and in a perfect world, they'll hear about it first. You might have other stakeholders like donors or sponsors or elected officials, that could kind of help you, and they want to hear about it next. Then things push out to the media and the public via social media, press releases, or whatever. But keeping that in mind, you don't want your staff and board to be blindsided by something. You certainly don't want the elected officials wondering why they didn't hear about it or had to read about it in the news. These are probably more examples that I would use for a sudden flare-up as you're responding to these kind of things. But as we're looking at decisions that our organizations need to make in the coming weeks and months, keeping in mind, who needs to hear about it in the right sequence, I think is important. So I'll talk a little bit about managing the media and social media. I'm not sure most of us are really thrust into the spotlight over the next few weeks, but some of us have been, and in particular, I think even some of the folks on this call, as I was seeing the registration list, have had some time, or certainly are going to be likely to get a call from the media saying, this is happening across town, what are you doing about it? Or I talked to your peer, they have a problem, do you have the same kind of problem? So first, we'll spend a couple minutes, and I want to keep an eye on my time, preparing messages for the media. First, the number one rule when you're dealing with the media is it's not about answering their questions, it's about delivering your message. So again, if you're taking some notes and you want to just write down only 3 or 4 things that I'm talking about today, I think that PAIR acronym is critical. And this is pretty important. And we've seen good politicians dodge this. I watch the news maybe in a different way than you guys do. But, when I see somebody being asked a question and I don't hear a direct answer, I gauge how well they're doing at deflecting that answer and saying, I heard your question, but this is really what I want to say instead. And we'll talk about that in a second. Henry Kissinger said it best, and I loved this quote. Does anybody have any questions for the answers? This is all I'm going to say are my answers and my canned responses. So does anybody have a question that fits into that? So when you're preparing messages either for the media or, maybe there's a conference call with your members or something, certainly getting those key messages down, and even in my case, today I just have this dopey little Post-it note with a handful of things I wanted to make sure that I covered. It's really important when you get that call from the media, it's okay to ask them, listen, can I just ask a few questions before we go further? Who else have you talked to, or who else are you planning to talk to? Getting a sense of who else they're speaking with could give you, a sense of how that reporter is shaping the story. Again, knowing who that right spokesperson is and asking them about what their deadline is, so thanks for calling. You caught me at my desk. I wasn't expecting your call. What's the nature of your call? Who else are you talking to? And what's your deadline? I want to get a sense of, let me just get some of that information because I don't want to give you an off the cuff response. I want to make sure the right person responds to you and make sure you get that response in time. It's not always 5 o'clock deadlines, unfortunately, anymore. There's 3 o'clock emails that go out, and all the reporters are looking to scoop each other on social media. So don't be surprised if they say, I need something within the hour. A few strategies, and I think as I think about this and what we're all going through, fighting emotion with emotion. If there is an issue and somebody was harmed or were angry about somebody that embezzled $800,000 from your former agency, I still carry this grudge. Fighting emotion with emotion, I think is important, being angered at those, who had misdeeds, or sympathy for those who were harmed. And in particular, this next bullet, I think, is really, really important. If there's one of the things that you're just taking some notes on, capturing this, putting a human face, putting a face to a crisis, humanizing your association is critical. Ours collectively is an industry that is really very human. This is, oops, let me go back. This is Dale Carnegie at his finest, that the sense that we're social creatures, and Kiki talked about this a lot in her presentation this morning. We exist, many of our associations and TPAs and hotels, to bring people together, to create that sense of community. So humanizing your association, putting a face on it, whether it's just your headshot in an e-blast that's going out, or even in particular, get out your iPhone, record a video of yourself and put it out on social media. Hey, everybody, it's, me, I'm the executive director of this association. I just want to, just give you guys a shout out, let you know we're talking to elected officials about whatever the issue is. We're trying to get information to you as quickly as possible. We're all in this together. I just wanted to touch base and say hi and whatever. Faces, not logos. Engaging third parties can be helpful. I think connecting with other associations or elected officials or consultants that kind of help bring a perspective to whatever the crisis is that you might be dealing with, I think that can be particularly helpful. I think I'm on track here in terms of just checking my time. Always be honest. Always be honest. If you don't know the answer, it's okay to say so. Don't answer a question you don't understand. Don't exaggerate. Always tell the truth. I think this is really critical. And in media training, we kind of emphasize this a lot more than I have time for this morning. So it's important, but I want to keep moving on. Again, just as a reminder, that number one rule, it's not about answering their questions. It's about delivering your message. You have a set of messages that you want to deliver, and making sure that you can steer those kind of things is critical. Couple media myths. They're not going to wait for all the facts. Don't be surprised if they say they have a 2 o'clock deadline and you call them back at 1:45 and it's already on the web. Context doesn't always matter when covering the news. They're not going to play it as I say it. Sometimes you're going to be misquoted or quoted selectively. And they do have bias. I mean, those are some of the realities. I say that with a sense of caution, not to freak anybody out or have them not talk to the media. Frankly, we need them more than they need us when it comes to, a lot of our organizations are very public and have very public impact. So I think that that's kind of critical that, we keep this in mind that, it's not always going to be the way that you might hope. I'll go through these next couple slides pretty quickly. Just some tips and things that you can come back to. I know this is being recorded and Vanessa, I think, is going to share it with everybody. So, keeping the shortest possible list of things you might want to say. If you're going to be talking with the media, just 3 quick key points. Nobody reads below the headline. They don't read deep 7,000 words, articles as often as they do other things. Having 1 or 2 things that you could say and just leave it at that is perfect. Obviously focusing on the positive, don't volunteer the negative. Nothing is ever off the record. Technically, you need consent from both the reporter and you to go into background. It's complicated. Not everybody adheres to it. It's just better thinking. You can't say anything is off the record. No comment feels like there's something that we have to hide. Be confident in your expertise. They're calling you because you have a point of view and a perspective, either as an industry, an organizational leader. Don't be afraid to correct misperceptions. I never answer a hypothetical. If a reporter says, well, what would you do if this happened? There's just too many other variables. The reporter has a sense of what that hypothetical is. What would you do if this crisis lasts another 4 months? What are you going to do if this goes on until August? Well, you know what? There's just too many variables for me to speak to that right now. And frankly, and I wouldn't say this, but the variables that we're facing right now is, okay, if this crisis goes through the summer, what does that mean for us? Is that really bad? It is. But are there going to be government stimulus packages? Well, I don't know. Can I add that to the hypothetical? So yes, it's lingering, but I don't have to pay my mortgage for 4 months. So is it, that bad? There's just too many variables that anybody can control in a hypothetical, and I don't recommend you fall into that. Just go over the basics. Don't use industry jargon. Again, be brief. Very often a good reporter will use an uncomfortable silence, of which I've given none of you this morning. But be brief and don't fall into that silent trap. They'll basically say, hey, Paul, what do you think is going to happen if this crisis lingers until August? Well, you know what? I don't really want to comment on that hypothetical because there's just too many other variables that could positively or negatively impact that. And then if they just sit there, they're waiting for me to keep going and keep talking, and that's where you get into trouble. Analogies are great. I know some friends of ours in building trades associations, builders and remodelers. About 10 years ago, we were looking at this housing boom, which was awesome. And once it started to soften a little bit, we said, well, wait a minute, we want to be able to take advantage of this, and it's still above normal. So we built out an analogy that said, well, yeah, when the housing boom was at its peak, it was like driving on the Northway or the Thruway at 120 miles an hour. And yeah, it might have softened a little bit, but now that means we're driving 80. And guess what? You can still get a ticket for that. So the point I want to make is the housing market is really still pretty robust. Analogies are great because reporters like those. People can get a good sense of how to understand the issue that you're facing. I won't read these word for word, but steering. So if it's not about answering their question, but delivering their message, these are great little, thoughts and sentence starters, where somebody might be saying, gets you back into saying what you want to say. So using some of these phrases at the beginning, if you don't want to answer their question directly, using some of these transitional phrases will kind of help you steer the conversation back to where you want to go. So let's talk about the coming weeks ahead. I hope it's weeks and not months. A good chess player thinks 3 moves ahead. A good chess player is not looking move for move, but they're trying to anticipate their owner. They're trying to anticipate what happens when they do this. And just so you think that this is smart, my father says, look, don't quote yourself, Paul. Don't be that guy. But I still think it's a great quote. Thinking a few moves ahead. Here's what we talked about last week. Here's what we talked about this week. What are we going to say next week? The good news is this too shall pass. But I think it's important for us to think about what we're going to say April 1st, April 3rd, to our members, to the people in the public, about what's happening and how we're responding to it. And frankly, planning now for some of those ramp up strategies and messages. This will be over, and it will be over hopefully sooner rather than later. And we're all going to be scrambling to get back to business as usual. What is it we want to say about our organization, about our association, about how we're back open for business and back to the new normal, or back to normal rather, and start to test and ask ourselves, how do these things sound? Are we building the right messages, and are we doing those things in the right sequence? Let's put it to the pair test and see how that works. So a couple other thoughts, keeping pair in mind, largely it's about people. And for many of you, it's about your members and your constituents and how you make their lives better. With routine business, you're helping them grow their careers, you're adding skill sets, you're helping them grow their businesses. Right now it's a lot about, and Kiki had a great little hire me list. What is it you're going to do for your members that might be different from your normal routine, business? What are the things that you can offer to help them during this time? This is both an operational advice as well as even some of the communication advice. But keeping people in mind, is critical. Communicate often. Even if you don't think you have anything to say, you can be copying and pasting news from somebody else, from the labor boards, just maybe even fun human moments. We're all seeing pictures of kids and cats all week as we're trying to do business from home, frogs, whatever it is. It's okay to be human as we're kind of going through this. Communicate regularly. And I think that this is important. And I heard this Monday or Tuesday on the Today Show. Somebody was talking about, it was parenting advice, for kids that now have to, learn at home. They have to homeschool, and learn remotely. What I'm seeing in a lot of places is this sense of just getting into a routine for ourselves, getting up, showering every morning at the right time, putting on a tie. This is the first tie I've worn like in a week, sorry. But that sense of routines, and even for your members, whatever you want to call it, if it's Monday moments or Tuesday trivia or Friday, whatever, but at least once a week and on a regular basis, and maybe you brand it and you call it Friday Facts. Here are the facts that are happening in our industry and what we're doing to help. A sense of that, let's go back to those C's, a confident tone. Our leadership's coming together. We want to share this with you so you can count on seeing something in your inbox every Friday. It does give people a sense of control. And I think that those routines will be helpful just to kind of help us right size the ship. And listening, up to this point I haven't, and normally it's a pretty interactive setting. I see a couple comments on here, but social media is great for asking questions. Ask your members what's keeping them up at night beyond the broader issue. How can our association staff and board kind of help guide you through this? What's on your mind? What are you worried about next? Just kind of listening. And that's what I love about social media is, trolls aside, it's a great venue to put something out and start to collect responses and really have a great conversation. And again, be human. This point that I was making earlier, look, it's our first pandemic together, and we're going to make mistakes. We're all in this together. I think people want us to be human, as we're going through this, and it's okay to be even a little bit vulnerable. Hearing leadership say, I don't have all the answers, but I'm working with our staff and board and some pretty bright minds to figure out and anticipate what our members' needs are. That's a great comment. I don't feel like I'm being bullshitted by anybody. And I know that you don't have all the answers because none of us do. We're making this up as we go along. So a couple things that I wanted to share, and I think these are good things to keep in mind as you're communicating with all of your different, publics. And I think these are things that will ultimately help you avoid damage to your brand, from a long term, during this downturn. So in summary, the need for communication grows the longer this lasts. Keep that in mind. People are going to want to hear from you often. They're going to want to hear from you regularly. Remember the PAIR acronym and the 3 C's, I guess. Keep both of those in mind as you're crafting your messages. If you are called before the media, remember that number one rule. It's not about answering their questions. It's about delivering your message. And communicate often, even if you have nothing new to say. Nothing wrong with an association putting out a comment just to say, hey, it's Monday morning, just want to check in. How's everybody feeling? Let's go take on the day. Be there for your people, whatever you call them, members, guests, whatever you call them, just be there for them. They're going to remember how you treated them long after this is over, how you're messaging to them difficult decisions that your organization needs to make, what you're doing to help members, how you're stepping outside of your normal routine, things you're doing for continuing education credits, and just helping them with job placement and resume skills, or putting out a job board or something like that. This is critical. Again, because as Kiki mentioned, we are all in this together. So please feel free to call us. I know many of you know my colleague Alex, who might, I think, be on this call, or myself. Our contact information is going to be here. We've basically stripped out every bit of overhead that we can, and everything else. We're just covering some minimal hourly costs, just to keep some of our people busy and working. If you want a sounding board, just give us a call. We're not going to start the meter. If you really need some deeper help, sure, we'd love to be a resource. But ultimately, as Kiki said, we're all in this together. And we want to be here, for your organizations, help you guys avoid missteps, because the faster everybody gets back to business, the faster we all get back to normal. So I think we do have a couple minutes, and just wanted to see if there's any questions, conversation, anybody have tales from the trenches that they want to share as we're kind of going through here. So Vanessa, I'll let you maybe moderate and kind of open and toggle microphones, or see how we can make this not a free for all anyway. So
absolutely. So
thank you folks for your time this morning.
Thank you, Paul. And yeah, if anybody has some questions, please feel free to either unmute yourself and ask a question, or type it in the chat box and we will get that over to Paul.
Oh, and I just saw Victoria's High School Musical reference, so thanks. Yeah, we're all seeing the same thing here. And good luck getting that song out of your head today, folks.
Don't be shy.
Well, welcome. No questions. Just thank you. You're welcome. Glad we could be here. Hopefully there were a couple, nuggets that were in here that, you guys can take to your day-to-day work and kind of keep things moving forward. So, cool.
All right. Well, Paul, I really appreciate your time with us today. I took away a lot of notes, so I appreciate the conversation. I think everybody here learned a little bit of something about how to manage the conversation and the narrative around the crisis we're all having. So thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for bringing us all together, Vanessa.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Okay.
All right, everybody. So we are going